June 18, 1940. London. Just after 6 p.m. The city was already darkened for air raids when a little-known French general stepped before a BBC microphone and declared that France had not lost the war. Charles de Gaulle spoke slowly, deliberately, knowing that his words defied not only the German Reich but his own government in Bordeaux. He called on French soldiers, sailors, and workers to continue the fight, without permission, without territory, without certainty. Across the city, Winston Churchill listened. The French army had collapsed in 6 weeks. Paris had fallen on June 14. Marshal Pétain had asked Germany for an armistice. Britain now stood alone. And yet, here was de Gaulle, unsupported, unappointed, and uncompromising, claiming to speak for France itself. Churchill understood the danger immediately. This was not merely rhetoric. It was a challenge to legality, diplomacy, and allied unity at a moment Britain could least afford division. The British cabinet had not agreed to recognize de Gaulle. The United States would not recognize him. Even many French officers dismissed him as an upstart. But de Gaulle would not retreat. When pressed by British officials to soften his language, to acknowledge the authority of Pétain's government, or to place his movement clearly under British command, he refused. France, he insisted, could accept aid, but never subordination. French honor required independence, even in exile. Churchill later remarked with a mixture of admiration and frustration that de Gaulle was the hardest man to get along with I ever knew. Yet, on that night, irritation gave way to calculation. Britain needed a French voice that had not surrendered. It needed legitimacy, symbolism, and resistance. Still, the alliance was born in tension. De Gaulle demanded to be treated not as a refugee general, but as the embodiment of France. Churchill needed unity, obedience, and control. Both men believed history had chosen them personally. Neither was inclined to yield. This first refusal, quiet, firm, and absolute, set the pattern for everything that followed. Cooperation would be forced, trust would be scarce, and every shared victory would carry the weight of unresolved conflict. The weeks that followed the broadcast hardened positions on both sides of the channel. By July 1940, London had become the political capital of a France that officially no longer existed. De Gaulle operated out of 2 small rooms in Carlton Gardens, surrounded by borrowed furniture, a skeleton staff, and constant suspicion. British intelligence monitored him closely. So did Churchill. Support was conditional, provisional, and always reversible. The British government recognized de Gaulle only as the leader of Free French forces, never as the head of a government. It was a deliberate limitation. Churchill could not afford to alienate Vichy France entirely. The Royal Navy still faced the possibility that the French fleet might fall into German hands. Diplomacy required ambiguity. De Gaulle despised it. On July 3, 1940, ambiguity ended in blood. At Mers-el-Kébir, near Oran in Algeria, British warships opened fire on the anchored French fleet. In less than 15 minutes, 1,297 French sailors were dead. Battleships burned. The sea is filled with oil and bodies. The attack was ordered by Churchill himself, an act meant to prove Britain would fight alone if it had to. De Gaulle was not warned. When he learned of the attack, his reaction was cold fury. He understood the strategic logic, but politically it was disastrous. Vichy propaganda seized the moment, branding Britain a traitor to France. Recruitment to the Free French slowed. Officers hesitated. Families wrote bitter letters. De Gaulle confronted Churchill soon after. He demanded assurances, recognition, and an end to British actions taken over the head of France. Churchill listened, then refused. Britain would make its own decisions. Survival came first. In private, Churchill vented. He described de Gaulle as a great trial, a man possessed by pride and grievance. Yet he continued to fund him, protect him, and place him before microphones. The contradiction was deliberate. De Gaulle was useful precisely because he was difficult. He could not be mistaken for a British puppet. The tension deepened as Free French forces attempted to seize control of French colonies in Africa. At Dakar in September 1940, a joint British Free French operation collapsed under resistance from Vichy loyalists. British shells struck French ships again. The mission failed. De Gaulle's authority was humiliated. British commanders blamed his overconfidence. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was forgiven. Each setback reinforced the same reality. Britain and Free France needed each other, but trusted neither. Every negotiation became a contest of wills. Every compromise felt like surrender. And at the center stood Churchill, increasingly aware that this alliance would not break cleanly. It would grind forward, fueled by necessity, restrained by resentment. By 1942, the war had widened, and so had the rift. The United States had entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, bringing with it fresh power and new complications. President Franklin Roosevelt had little patience for Charles de Gaulle. He viewed him as authoritarian, inflexible, and politically dangerous. Washington preferred to deal with compliant French officials in North Africa, men who had served Vichy but were now willing to switch sides. Churchill stood between them. In November 1942, Allied forces landed in French North Africa under Operation Torch. The landings bypassed de Gaulle entirely. He was not informed in advance. Instead, American diplomats struck deals with Admiral François Darlan, a senior Vichy figure, effectively legitimizing a collaborator in exchange for immediate military cooperation. When de Gaulle learned of it, he erupted. From London, he denounced the arrangement as a betrayal of French honor. He warned Churchill that France was being treated not as an ally, but as occupied territory. He demanded recognition as the sole representative of the French nation and threatened to withdraw cooperation if Free French forces were marginalized. Churchill summoned him. The meeting was tense, clipped, and deeply personal. Churchill spoke of military necessity, of American sensitivities, of the fragile architecture holding the Allied coalition together. De Gaulle listened in silence, then replied that France could not be rebuilt on expediency alone. He would not accept orders issued through former collaborators. He would not bow to Washington. He would not compromise. Churchill later recalled the exchange with exasperation. He has no government, he told colleagues, no army worth the name, and yet demands to be treated as if he were France herself. Still, Churchill refused to abandon him. Behind closed doors, Churchill defended de Gaulle to Roosevelt, arguing that France without de Gaulle would mean France without dignity, and that humiliation would poison post-war Europe. Publicly, he urged de Gaulle to restrain himself, to speak less, to yield symbolically. De Gaulle refused again. Instead, he escalated. Through broadcasts and proclamations, he asserted continuity between pre-war France and Free France. He spoke not of liberation by the Allies, but of France liberating herself. The words were chosen carefully. So were the implications. Every sentence tightened the noose. Churchill began to realize that de Gaulle's resistance was not tactical, it was existential. To yield even once would destroy the very thing de Gaulle claimed to embody. And Churchill, for all his impatience, understood that kind of logic. It was the logic of men who would not bend, only endure. June 1943, Algiers. The heat pressed down on the city like a held breath. France was returning to the map, but not yet to herself. The Allies had pushed Axis forces out of North Africa. The Mediterranean was reopening. Planning had begun for the invasion of Europe. And once again, the same question poisoned every meeting. Who spoke for France? The Americans insisted on balance. They forced the creation of a joint French authority, the French Committee of National Liberation, shared between Charles de Gaulle and General Henry Girard, a senior officer more acceptable to Washington. It was meant as a compromise. It was, in truth, a test. De Gaulle saw it immediately for what it was. He was expected to share legitimacy with a man he considered politically empty and morally compromised. He was expected to restrain his language, defer to Allied administrators, and accept that France's liberation would be managed by others. He was expected to be patient. He refused. In meeting after meeting, de Gaulle dismantled the arrangement piece by piece. He outmaneuvered Giraud in speeches, in committees, in public appearances. He cultivated officers. He appealed directly to resistance leaders inside occupied France. He spoke as if authority were already his, because, in his mind, it was. Churchill watched this with mounting alarm. The invasion of Normandy was less than a year away. Allied unity was brittle. Roosevelt was furious. American officials warned that de Gaulle would be excluded entirely if he did not compromise. Churchill carried these warnings personally. In a private exchange, exasperation finally broke through restraint. Churchill told him in substance that the war could not be run on wounded pride, that Britain had bent repeatedly to survive, that France, defeated and occupied, could not dictate terms to its liberators. And then came the line, delivered not as an insult, but as a warning. If de Gaulle continued on this path, he would end in isolation, wrapped in his own dignity. De Gaulle did not raise his voice. He answered that France had been isolated before, on June 18, 1940, and that isolation had been preferable to surrender. He would not trade recognition for obedience. He would not place French forces under foreign political control. He would not allow France to be liberated without France. This was the point of no return. Churchill could have broken him then. He could have cut funding, denied access, or withdrawn protection. For days, the possibility was real. Cabinet members urged it. American pressure intensified. Instead, Churchill chose endurance. He allowed de Gaulle to consolidate power in Algiers. He tolerated the marginalization of Giraud. He accepted, without formal declaration, that de Gaulle was becoming the unavoidable fact of France. It was not approval, it was recognition of reality. The decision was irreversible. From that moment on, there would be no Allied administration of France without de Gaulle's consent. No French army without his authority. No post-war settlement in Europe could ignore him. The cost was constant friction. The benefit was legitimacy. Churchill paid the price knowingly. August 25, 1944. Paris, late afternoon. The bells of Notre Dame rang as German forces surrendered the city. Crowds flooded the streets, shouting, weeping, embracing armed men in unfamiliar uniforms. At the head of the procession, walking deliberately down the Champs-Élysées under the threat of sniper fire, was Charles de Gaulle. He walked as if the matter had already been settled. The Allies had liberated Paris militarily, but politically, de Gaulle arrived not as a beneficiary, but as a sovereign. There was no Allied military government installed, no temporary authority, no declaration of trusteeship. France, by de Gaulle's insistence and Churchill's reluctant accommodation, resumed itself. Churchill watched from London. He sent congratulations, he offered praise, but privately he understood what had happened. The struggle he had fought for 4 years, not against Germany, but with France, had reached its conclusion. De Gaulle had won without ever yielding. Their final wartime exchanges remained cool, formal, and restrained. There was no reconciliation, only closure. Churchill never forgot the difficulty. De Gaulle never acknowledged dependence. Each believed he had saved something essential. Churchill, the coalition, de Gaulle, the nation. In the months that followed, France re-emerged as a victorious power, seated at Allied tables, occupying a zone in Germany, and wielding a permanent voice. None of it had been guaranteed. All of it had been demanded. Churchill later reflected that de Gaulle thought himself France. It was not entirely critical. It was recognition. History had allowed it, because circumstances had made it necessary. This was not the story of friendship. It was the story of survival through friction, of alliances held together not by warmth, but by shared danger and mutual limits, of two men too proud to yield, forced to coexist because the alternative was collapse. When de Gaulle refused to compromise, Churchill understood something older than diplomacy. Nations, like men, require dignity to endure, even when it obstructs, even when it infuriates. The war ended, the alliance dissolved, the consequences remained.